Tonight, a true story from Japan, gentle enough to carry you to sleep. A young vet, a dying cat, and the secret only midnight lets her hear. Let your eyes close now, and let this quiet story carry you gently toward sleep. In a small animal hospital on the quiet edge of Tokyo, tucked inside a university complex too modest to impress anyone, a newly licensed vet named Hannah sat alone in the hush of the night ward, watching a dog's ribs rise and fall under the lamp. She was only a few weeks into the job she had dreamed of since she was a girl small enough to carry a stray home in her school bag. And already she understood that the hospital ran on rules nobody had ever taught her in school. Her supervising vet, a man named Kenji, was 10 years older than her and a great deal more certain of everything. And he liked to remind her that a clinic was not a shrine. Kindness alone, he would say, had never once paid for a bag of antibiotics. Some weeks from that night, in a dark apartment with the lights left off, Hannah would kneel beside a nest of folded towels and hear a small, rough voice say, quite plainly, that its stomach was empty. She would sit very still afterward, telling herself that tired minds invent things, though some quiet part of her would already have begun to believe otherwise. But that was still ahead of her, a week she hadn't lived yet. And for now, there was only the ordinary hum of the refrigerator where the vaccines were kept. The smell of antiseptic never quite left her sleeves, no matter how many times she washed them. Kenji had a way of saying things that made them sound like simple arithmetic, and in the beginning Hannah had almost admired him for it, the way you admire someone who never seems to lose an argument. He told her that if a vet tried to save every stray, every unpaying owner, every hopeless case that limped through the door, that vet would be bankrupt inside a year, and useless after that to every animal that came looking for help afterward. Veterinary medicine, he liked to say, existed under the law for the sake of people, not animals, and the sooner a young vet learned the difference, the easier her life would be. Hannah had heard this kind of talk before, in lecture halls, from professors who wanted to seem practical. She had never quite believed it would be the whole shape of her working life. She had wanted, since she was small, to be the gentle kind of vet, the kind who knelt on the floor with a frightened animal and spoke to it in the voice you'd use for a frightened child. Instead, she found herself standing beside Kenji in the pharmacy room some afternoons, watching him pass over the plain, perfectly adequate antibiotic for the newer one in the brighter box. The one that cost 3 times as much and did, by his own quiet admission, more or less the same job. It looks better on the invoice, he told her once, not unkindly, the way a man explained a fact about the weather. A worried owner will pay more, he said, for medicine that looks like it's working harder. Hannah thought of the owners themselves, the way they came through the door with an animal held against their chest like something already breaking. There is a particular fear in a person who loves something that cannot tell them what's wrong, and she had come to know its exact shape. She thought about how it must feel to be handed a bill built for medicine your pet never needed, when all you had wanted, walking in, was for somebody to help. That was the part she could not make her peace with, not the profit itself, which she understood well enough in the abstract, but the particular unkindness of billing people at the exact moment they were most afraid. In her apartment that night, with the rain starting outside in the unhurried way rain starts in Tokyo in autumn, Hannah sat at her small table and did not bother turning on the overhead light. She let the street lamp do the work instead, a soft orange wash falling across the tatami mat that had come with the apartment, worn pale in the shape of someone else's footsteps. Her mother had called earlier that evening, the way she did most weeks, and Hannah had told her that work was fine, which was the kind of small-eyed daughters tell, so their mothers can sleep. She hadn't mentioned the antibiotics or Kenji's calm voice explaining margins the way other men explain baseball, because she wasn't sure yet how to say it without sounding like she was failing at the one thing she had wanted her whole life. Hannah had graduated near the top of her class, had cried actual tears the day her license arrived in the mail. She had pictured, in the private and slightly embarrassing way you picture things at 24, a version of herself who healed animals because it mattered and for no other reason. The hospital she had landed in instead was not cruel exactly. Nobody there turned an animal away outright, or raised a hand, or did anything a stranger walking past would have called wrong. It was something quieter than that, and harder to name, a kind of tiredness dressed up as professionalism. Kenji was not a villain, if she was honest with herself, sitting there in the lamp-colored dark. He simply believed, all the way down, that sentiment was a debt a small clinic could not afford to keep paying. He had said as much to her that very afternoon, standing in the hallway with his arms folded, mentioning that a vet who fell in love with every patient wouldn't last 5 years in this business. Love, he told her, was not whatever she believed load-bearing. Hannah had wanted to argue with him and hadn't, partly because he outranked her, and partly because some small, cowardly corner of her worried that his numbers, at least, were probably true. Still, something in her had gone quiet and stubborn since the job began. The particular stubbornness of a person deciding, without quite admitting it yet, that she cannot keep doing a thing the way she has been asked to do it. She thought, not for the first time, about simply leaving, handing in a short, polite resignation, and going to work instead for one of the volunteer groups that patched up stray cats behind the train station for nothing but gratitude. It wouldn't pay well, she knew that. It might not pay at all, some months, but at least she wouldn't have to watch someone hand over money they didn't have for medicine an animal never needed. She was aware in a distant way of how young the thought sounded, how it was the kind of plan a person makes at midnight and quietly sets down again by morning. But it kept returning to her anyway in the gaps between patients, in the walk home past the convenience store with its 2 bright windows, in the moment just before sleep, when the day's small arguments replayed themselves without asking her permission. Back at the hospital the next morning, the fluorescent lights buzzed on one by one down the corridor, and Hannah found Kenji already at his desk, moving through invoices with the calm of a man who has never once lost sleep over a decision. He glanced up at her and mentioned, in the mild tone he used for things he considered obvious, that a soft heart was a fine thing to keep at home, and a liability to bring to work. She would understand eventually, he added, the way everyone did. Hannah said nothing to that, only nodded the way you nod at weather you cannot change, and went to check on the animals boarded overnight. The ordinary parade of coughs and limps, and one elderly dog recovering slowly from a surgery 2 days before. There was a corner of the ward, past the last row of cages, where the light was dimmer and the animals seemed to settle faster. She found herself standing there longer than she needed to most mornings, simply breathing. It was strange, she would think later, how much of that early unhappiness lived not in any single cruel moment, but in the slow accumulation of small ones. 100 tiny decisions made for the sake of a number rather than a life. She kept a private list in her head, without quite meaning to. The medicine chosen for its price tag, the gentle warning not to get attached, the flat, arithmetic version of a job she had once imagined as something closer to devotion. And yet she stayed that week and the one after it, telling herself it was only because she was new, that every young vet passed through a season like this one, and it would either harden her the way it had hardened Kenji, or it wouldn't, and she would find out soon enough which. At night, with the street lamp light and the rain that came and went without asking anyone's permission, she sometimes thought about the voice she believed she must have imagined. The small, rough voice from a nest of folded towels that hadn't been made yet. And she wondered, half asleep, what an animal would even say, if it could say anything at all. For now, there was only the hum of the old refrigerator and the smell of antiseptic on her sleeves. And Kenji's calm, tired voice somewhere down the hall, explaining to someone else the difference between a business and a shelter. Hannah closed her eyes that night, still uncertain whether she would stay through the winter or leave it all behind for good. Only certain that something in her had begun, quietly and without any drama at all, to wait. And outside, the rain kept on, unhurried, the way it does when it has nowhere in particular to be, settling over the small hospital and over the tired, hopeful young woman inside it, who let herself at last drift towards sleep. Let that moment rest now, just as it was. There's no need to hurry away from it. We can stay with them a little longer, letting the quiet settle over everything like a soft blanket pulled up to the chin. Somewhere in that stillness, the night keeps turning slow and unhurried, the way it always does when the hardest part is already past and only the aftermath remains, gentle and forgiving. If your eyes have grown heavy, let them close for a moment. Nothing here will be lost if you drift for a breath or two. The story is not finished, only resting beside you. And when you're ready, we'll ease forward together, further into that same long night, following the same quiet thread a little deeper into what comes next. Long after the last ordinary patients had gone home for the night, the University Animal Hospital on the quiet edge of Tokyo kept just one lamp burning at the front desk. There, a young vet named Hannah sat filling in notes she barely needed to write. Her license only a few months old, still new enough that the smell of antiseptic and the low hum of the vaccine fridge felt like things she hadn't quite grown used to yet. Down the hall, a dog recovering from a rough night was sleeping in its kennel, and Hannah had already decided to sit up with it until morning anyway, So when a soft knock came at the glass door, it didn't feel like an interruption at all. When she opened it, an elderly woman was standing under the awning in a thin cardigan and cradled against her chest, wrapped in a hand towel gone soft from years of washing, was a cat who wasn't moving. The woman gave her name quietly as Yuki and said that something was wrong with her cat, that he wouldn't wake up no matter how long she had sat beside him calling his name. The cat's name, she said, was Tama, and he was 19 years old, an American shorthair whose face had gone round and soft the way old cats' faces do, silver crowding in around his whiskers and his eyes. Hannah took him gently from her arms and felt at once how light he was, lighter than a cat his size should ever be, his breath arriving in small, shallow pulls that never quite reached the bottom of his chest. On the table, under the bright exam lamp, Tama didn't stir at all, not when she checked his gums, not when she checked the color and clarity of his eyes. There is a particular kind of stillness that a vet learns to recognize early in the work, a stillness that isn't quite sleep and isn't quite anything else either. This was that kind. She told Yuki, as gently as she knew how, that his kidneys seemed to be failing and that this was very likely what had brought on the state he was in now. But she would need to keep him overnight, she explained, to run a fuller set of tests before she could say anything more certain about what came next. Yuki nodded slowly at that, the way people nod when they've already half-guessed an answer before it's given to them, and said only that she understood and that she would come back the following day. And then she left, alone, back out into the night, and Hannah stood a moment at the door and watched her go, a small figure walking home under the street lamps to what was probably a quiet apartment with one empty cat bed waiting in it. She found herself thinking that Yuki and Tama had likely been alone together for a very long time. Just the two of them, the way it happens sometimes when a life narrows gently down to one other creature you talk to every single day. There was something almost restful in that thought, she noticed, even on a night like this one. Almost. By morning, Tama still hadn't woken, and Hannah had spent what remained of the night moving quietly between his cage and the recovering dogs, checking one small, unmoving shape after another under the low blue light of the ward. The blood work came back first, and then the scans, and she read through all of it at her desk with the particular patience of someone who already half suspects what she's about to find and is only waiting for the numbers to say it plainly. The illness, it turned out, wasn't sitting in one place that could be cut away and left behind. It had spread through nearly all of him, quietly, over what must have been months, the kind of sickness that gives almost no warning at all until the body simply cannot carry it any further. His kidneys were failing on top of that, and his heart, worn down by 19 years and now by everything else besides, wasn't far behind them either. Hannah sat with the images a long moment before she let herself feel anything about them. 19 years, she thought, was already a long life for a cat, longer than most cats ever get. And there was a version of this where she could simply tell herself that Tama had had his whole life, every ordinary afternoon of it, and that this was only how such lives end. But some part of her, the part that hadn't yet learned the careful distance the older vets kept, still felt the whole day settle over her like something heavy. What she decided, in the end, was that there was nothing left to fix, only pain that could be made smaller, and that the kindest thing now would be to keep him comfortable enough to go home. Whatever time remained, she thought, should be spent there, in his own rooms, with Yuki, rather than under a hospital light. When Yuki came that afternoon and heard all of it, she didn't cry. Not there in the exam room, though something behind her eyes went very still and very far away for a moment. She asked only whether she might have one more day to prepare a few things at home, a blanket folded just so, perhaps a bed moved nearer the window, or whatever it is a person quietly arranges when they know they are about to bring someone they love home to say goodbye to. Hannah told her that of course she could, and meant it, and promised they would keep Tama warm and comfortable until then. Yuki thanked her twice in that careful, over-polite way people thank you when they're trying very hard not to come apart in front of a stranger, and then she left again, out into the pale afternoon light. The day went on the way hospital days do, in small, ordinary tasks, and between all of them Hannah kept returning to Thomas' side, adjusting the line that fed him fluids, tucking the towel back around his shoulders, talking to him sometimes without quite meaning to. It was early evening when she came to check on him once more, the light outside gone that soft gray gold that turns just before dusk, the kind of light that makes a room feel like it's holding its breath. She had meant it to be a quick look, a last check before she went home herself for a few hours sleep. And that was when Tama opened his eyes. Not fully, not the way a healthy cat wakes all at once, but enough that Hannah saw the lids move, saw the effort in them, saw them working to bring something in a room into focus. He lifted his head only a little, the thin muscles of his neck straining with an effort that looked, to her, like it was spending nearly everything he had left in the world. His ears turned first toward the door, toward the hallway beyond it, the way a cat's ears turn when they're following a sound no one else in the room can hear. Then his head followed, slow and unsteady, searching the room the way a cat searches when it's looking for one particular person among all the wrong ones. Hannah stayed very still and let him look. He wasn't looking for her. She understood that at once, and there was no mistaking the shape of what he wanted. The small, determined turning of his head toward the hallway, toward wherever some old, worn instinct in him still believed the rest of his world might be waiting. And then he said, once a thin and threadbare sound that had almost nothing of a young cat's voice left inside it, just breath and old habit shaped around the one small word he had. It was unmistakably a call for Yuki. Hannah had heard animals cry out before, in fear, in pain, in ordinary confusion, the way any vet has, but she would say afterward that she had never quite heard anything like this one. An old, dying cat, spending what little strength remained his failing body to ask, one more time, for the one person who had spent 19 years of ordinary evenings beside him. Not asking to be fixed, not asking for the pain to stop, only asking in the one voice he had left for her. Hannah found herself answering him anyway, softly, telling him that Yuki was coming back tomorrow, that he was safe here for now, that he didn't need to be afraid, even as some part of her doubted a cat could take much comfort from a stranger's voice in an unfamiliar room. But something in him seemed to settle all the same, whether at the low sound of a gentle voice or simply because the small act of crying out had used up whatever he had left to spend. His head came back down onto the towel, slowly, the way a held breath finally lets go, and his eyes closed again, and his breathing settled back into that same shallow rhythm it had kept all through the night before. Hannah stood over him along while after that, in the quiet of the ward, the recovering dog asleep down the hall, the evening going fully dark now beyond the window. She thought about Yuki somewhere across the city, folding a blanket or choosing a spot by a window, getting a home ready for a day that hadn't arrived yet. She thought, too, about how strange it was to be this new at the work and already know something no textbook in her training had ever told her plainly. That love in an animal doesn't always need a name to reach for. Sometimes it only needs a direction. She turned a ward lamp down low before she finally left for the night, the way she always did, so that whatever dreams an old cat still had in him might come quietly, undisturbed, until the morning found him again. And that, for tonight, is where we'll leave them, the old cat and the woman he was calling for, one asleep now under a dim blue light, the other folding a blanket by a window somewhere in the dark of the city, each of them, in their own quiet way, still waiting to be brought back to the other. Let that moment rest now, soft and unhurried, exactly the way it settled between them a moment ago. If your eyes have already closed, that is all right. You do not have to follow every word to stay held inside this story. We stay with them a little longer, in that same quiet stretch of night, while whatever passed between them settles slowly, like dust after footsteps fade. Take a slow breath in and let it out even more slowly. There is no rush here and nothing to catch up on. The night keeps unfolding at its own gentle pace, and so does this story, carrying us forward without hurry, toward whatever comes next for them, while you rest. In a small clinic near the edge of Tokyo, a young vet named Hannah lifted the telephone for the third time that morning and let it ring, alone, into a line that no one would ever answer. The number belonged to an elderly woman named Yuki, who 3 nights before had carried in a thin, silver-furred cat named Tama and promised, in a small, quiet voice, that she would come back for him. Now the line only hummed, flat and empty, the sound of absolutely nothing at all, and Hannah set the receiver down as gently as if it still held some warmth worth saving. She tried the number twice more before lunch. Out of a stubbornness she could not entirely explain herself, and both times a recorded voice told her, without any feeling in it, that the number was no longer in service. It was a receptionist, a soft-spoken older man named Daichi, who found the second problem when he went looking for the address on Yuki's intake form, so he could mail a gentle reminder about the balance still owed. The street simply did not exist. Daichi checked it twice against the district map pinned beside the front counter, running one finger slowly along a road that ran out of numbers long before it reached the one Yuki had written down, and then he looked up at Hannah without saying anything at all. Hannah remembered, then, how carefully the old woman had filled in that form that first night, how her pen had moved across the paper without any hesitation, as though she had rehearsed it, and Hannah understood, with a small cold drop somewhere behind her ribs, that none of it had been a mistake. A false name might have been kindness, she thought, or it might have been shame, or it might simply have been an old woman doing the one hard thing left to do, quietly, so that no one would come looking for her afterward to ask how she could have left him. Whatever the reason, Yuki was not coming back. And somewhere in the clinic's back room, a 19-year-old cat with one notched ear and a coat that had once been a handsome silver lay waiting for a hand that would never again lift him gently by the middle and carry him home to a windowsill he liked. By the time Hannah carried this news down the corridor, Kenji already seemed to know, the way he so often seemed to know the shape of a bad situation before anyone had even finished describing it to him. He was the senior vet at the clinic, 10 years older than Hannah, a man some of the younger staff quietly called cold, though what he called himself, without much humor in it, was simply realistic. A clinic could not be run on kindness alone. He liked to remind them, and Hannah had heard some version of that sentence more times than she could easily count since the week she first started. Medicine cost money. He would say electricity cost money. Even the paper towels folded in the supply closet cost money. And none of it, however much anyone wished otherwise, was ever paid for by good intentions. Standing now at the door of the recovery room, looking in at Tama through the wire of the cage, Kenji said, in the same even voice he used for almost everything, that there was no longer any owner, and so there was no longer any bill that would ever be paid. He said they would stop the fluids by the end of the week and stop the pain medication soon after, and simply let the cat's own failing body decide the rest of it, the way it would have decided things out on the street if he had never been carried in here at all. It was not cruelty in his mind, so much as arithmetic, and Hannah understood, even as something in her stomach turned slowly over, that from where he stood, the numbers really did seem to add up that way. He reminded her, not unkindly, that the clinic could not take in every abandoned animal that happened to come through its doors, that if it tried, it would not exist by next year, and then it could help no one at all, not even the animals whose owners did pay. He had said all of this before about other animals in other months, and every time Hannah had swallowed the words whole and gone quietly back to her charts, because he was, after all, the one whose name hung on a license by the door. This time, though, standing over a cat who had already lived through some private war that no one else would ever fully understand, something in her simply refused to swallow it. She looked at Tama for a long moment, the way you might look at someone sleeping who does not know they are being watched. His fur had thinned in patches she had not noticed the first night, and his ribs showed faintly through it with every slow breath, each one a little more work than the last had been. The foreline ran into one thin foreleg, taped with more care than the clinic's usual economy allowed, because Hannah herself had taped it that way 2 nights before without quite deciding to. His eyes were half open, cloudy now at the edges with age, and when she leaned closer he made no sound at all, only that slow rise and fall which told her he was, for the moment, still here. She found herself thinking, standing there, about the vet she had once imagined becoming, back when she was a girl who kept bringing home injured sparrows and expecting her mother to be pleased about it. That imagined version of herself had never once thought about arithmetic, or insurance forms, or which antibiotic carried the better margin. Because in that early dream, the only question that ever mattered was whether the animal in front of her could be helped. Somewhere between that girl and this corridor, she had let herself believe the dream was simply naive, a thing to be outgrown the way you outgrow believing a stuffed animal can hear you when you whisper to it at night. Standing here now, though, in front of a cat the whole system around her had already quietly agreed to let go, she was no longer so sure the girl had been wrong about anything. It was not that Kenji's numbers were false, exactly. It was only that somewhere inside the true numbers there remained a small, stubborn, illogical space where a person could still choose to stand anyway. And Hannah, without entirely meaning to, had just found herself standing in it. What came out of her mouth next surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise Kenji, because she had not, in any careful or considered way, decided beforehand to say it. "I'll take care of him," she told him, and then, before he could answer, she heard her own voice add that she would do it on her own time, and if it came to that, with her own money as well. Looking back on that moment much later, she would come to feel it had not been a very professional thing to say, and that a more seasoned vet would have known better than to make a promise like that to an animal who might not see out the week. But in the moment itself, there had been no room left for professionalism at all. Only the plain fact of a small animal breathing slowly behind wire mesh, and a woman who could not make herself walk past it and go home. Kenji studied her for a moment with an expression she could not quite place, somewhere between doubt and something almost like curiosity, the look of a man watching someone attempt arithmetic he was fairly certain would not come out even. He told her, finally, that it was her own time to spend however she liked, and that the clinic would not stand in her way, though he warned her, in the same flat voice he used for everything, that he did not expect the ending to be any different. He did not say that she was being foolish, exactly, though Hannah suspected he was thinking it, and in a strange way she found she did not mind, because for the first time since she had come to work at that clinic, she was not waiting on anyone's permission to care about something. That evening, once the waiting room had emptied out and the last of the fluorescent lights at the front of the building had been switched off, Hannah went back to the chart clipped to Tama's cage and quietly crossed out the order that said to stop. In its place, she wrote her own name, and beneath it, in small, careful letters, a new plan of her own, one more bag of fluids, one more dose to keep the worst of the pain down, one more night, and then she told herself, however many nights after that turned out to be needed. She mixed the saline herself, warming it a little between her palms the way she had once read that frightened animals seemed to prefer, and she talked to Tama the whole time in a low, steady voice, telling him that the old woman had probably not meant to abandon him, whatever it looked like from where he lay. She had no real way of knowing, that night, whether any of that was true, but it felt like the sort of thing worth saying anyway, into the quiet, to a small silver cat who could not answer her back. When the drip was finally running slow and even, she pulled a stool close to the cage and sat with him a while, the way you might sit up through the night with someone in a hospital who has no one else coming to visit. Outside, The city went on without noticing any of it, its lights blurring faintly through the clinic's front window, and somewhere far off a late train made its last low pass of the evening. Hannah did not yet know what the coming days would ask of her, only that she had made a kind of promise in that small room, quiet and half-accidental, the sort of promise you cannot really take back once it has been said aloud. And so, for tonight, that much was enough: a cat breathing evenly in the dim light, and a young vet who had decided, almost without meaning to, that she would not be the one to let him go. Let that moment rest now, just as it was, without needing to be smoothed over or explained any further. We can stay with him a little longer in the quiet that follows, letting the feeling settle the way water settles once nothing more disturbs it. There is no need to hurry toward what comes next. The same night is still unfolding around them, slow and unbroken, carrying its own weight forward in its own time. If your eyes have already closed, that is all right. The story will keep going gently, without asking anything of you. Take a slow breath in and a slower one out. We continue now, still within the same story, still within the same night. In a small apartment on the quiet edge of Tokyo, a young veterinarian named Hannah knelt on the tatami each evening beside an elderly cat named Tama, warming a little dish of soft food between her palms before she offered it to him. This had become her second job, unpaid and unspoken, the one she never wrote down anywhere. 3 weeks now of measuring out medicine in a small plastic syringe and coaxing it, drop by drop, past his teeth. Tama was 19 years old, an American shorthair with a face that had once, she imagined, been rounder and more mischievous, and a body that the illness had worn down to something light and fragile in her hands. The apartment smelled, most nights, of warmed rice and the faint sting of antiseptic, and underneath that, of the cheap incense she burned so the whole place wouldn't smell like a clinic. She had folded an old towel into a nest beside the low table, and it was there that Thomas spent his days, watching her with a patience that never seemed to ask for anything. Some nights, she came home so tired from her shift that she sat down on the floor beside him before she even took off her coat and simply breathed for a while before she started the medicine. The syringe work was slow and careful, a little at a time, because his throat was weak and because startling him would undo an hour of trust in a single moment. She learned to hold him the way you'd hold something you were afraid of dropping, one hand cupped beneath his ribs, feeling how each breath moved through him like a small tide going out and coming back in. In the first days, there had been little to see for all of it. No clear sign that any of this was doing more than delaying something sad and certain. But she kept at it anyway, because she had said she would, and because some part of her had already decided that this cat was not going to die friendless in the back of a clinic that had already decided he wasn't worth the trouble. And slowly, the way a kettle takes its own time coming to a boil, things began to change. By the second week, Tama was lifting his head on his own when she came through the door, turning his ears toward the sound of her key before she'd even opened it. By the middle of the third, he was eating small bites of soft food straight from the dish instead of from her fingers, and the sound of him actually chewing, unhurried, almost bored, made her laugh out loud the first time she heard it. The pain was still there, she knew, somewhere underneath, because the illness itself hadn't gone anywhere and never would. But it had loosened its grip enough that he could sit up in a patch of afternoon light without his whole body trembling from the effort of it. He began to groom himself again in small, tired passes, and the fur along his back, once dull and matted, started to lie smooth again wherever her brush had been. One evening she found him standing, actually standing on legs that still shook a little, reaching his front paws up toward the low windowsill to look out at the lit windows of the building across the street. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she had been bracing herself for the opposite, and she stood in the doorway with her bag still over her shoulder and let herself feel, just for a moment, something close to relief. Somewhere in those weeks, it became her habit to talk to him, the way people talk to plants or to photographs of someone gone, not expecting an answer, just needing somewhere to put the words. She told him about the clinic, about the parts of the job that still didn't sit right with her, about the senior colleague who measured every kindness against its cost. She never once expected him to understand any of it, and that, she would think back on later, was exactly what made what happened next so hard to hold on to. The evening it happened had been an unremarkable one, the kind that blurred easily into all the others that month, long and gray and heavier than it needed to be. She had stayed late at the clinic finishing paperwork nobody else wanted to do, and by the time she climbed the stairs to her apartment, her feet felt like they belonged to someone else. She let herself in without turning on the light, too tired even for that small motion, and stood for a moment in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust to the dark blue quiet of the room. Out of nothing more than habit, the same worn little ritual she performed every night, whether or not anyone was listening, she said softly that she was home and asked how he was feeling. She was already halfway to setting her bag down when the answer came, plain and unhurried, from the direction of the towel nest on the floor, and it said that his stomach was empty. For a moment she didn't move at all, because the sentence had arrived in a voice, an actual voice, low and a little rough at the edges, and it had come from exactly where Tama was lying. She told herself, in the space of that first frozen second, that she must be more tired than she'd thought, that some radio downstairs was carrying through the thin walls, that her mind was already halfway into a dream she hadn't meant to start. But the voice came again, unbothered by her silence, saying again, quite simply, that he was hungry, the way anyone might mention it in passing on an ordinary evening. Her bag slipped from her shoulder and landed on the floor with a soft, forgotten thud, and she didn't reach to pick it up. In the dim light from the window, she could just make out his eyes, catching what little glow there was from the street outside, watching her with the same unhurried patience he always had. Her knees found the tatami before she quite decided to kneel, folding underneath her the way they might if she'd been standing too long in the cold. She asked him, in a voice she barely recognized as her own, whether that had truly been him, whether he had really just spoken, and she waited, holding the question out into the dark like something fragile. He didn't answer that part at all, and instead simply repeated, patient as ever, that his stomach was empty, as though the matter of whether cats were supposed to talk was hers to worry about and not his. She would think, much later, that this was the strangest detail of all, stranger even than the voice itself, that he never once seemed to notice anything unusual was happening. For a long moment, she simply knelt there in the near dark, one hand pressed flat against the cool tatami, feeling her own pulse in her fingertips, and let the impossible thing settle over her without trying to explain it away. And then, because he was still hungry, and because that at least was a fact she knew exactly what to do with, she made herself stand up on legs that didn't quite feel steady yet. She warmed the food in her palms the way she always did, moving through the motions on a kind of muscle memory, while the rest of her mind stayed several steps behind, still kneeling on the floor in shock. Her hands shook a little as she set the dish down in front of him, and she found herself watching his small, ordinary movements, the tilt of his head, the soft sound of eating, as if they might explain what she had just heard. He ate the way he always ate, unhurried and thorough, and said nothing more while he did it. And somehow that quiet was almost as strange to her now as the speaking had been. When he had finished, he settled himself back into the folded towel with a small sigh, tucking his paws beneath him, and closed his eyes as though the last few minutes had been nothing at all. She sat down on the floor beside him again, not trusting herself yet to stand, and did not reach for the light switch, some instinct telling her that whatever had just happened belonged more easily to the dark than it would to a bright room. For a long while she simply listened to him breathe, slow and even, the small tide of it rising and falling under the thin fur, and let the apartment stay exactly as quiet as it had been before he spoke. She thought about calling someone, her mother, a friend, anyone who might tell her she'd only imagined it, and then thought better of it because she already knew how it would sound out loud. Instead, she told herself, gently, the way you might reassure a child after a nightmare, that she had been running on too little sleep for too many weeks, and that tomorrow, in daylight, this would probably feel like something she'd dreamed. But some quieter, steadier part of her, the part that had held the syringe every night for 3 weeks and felt his breathing change under her hands, already knew that wasn't quite true. She stayed on the floor a little longer, close enough to feel the faint warmth coming off his small body, and found, to her own surprise, that she wasn't frightened, not really, only wide awake in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Eventually, she lay down where she was, her head resting near the edge of his towel, too tired and too full of the evening to move to her own futon, and let the sound of his breathing become the only thing she was listening to. She thought, just before sleep took her, that whatever this was, it could wait until morning to be understood, and that for tonight it was enough that he had eaten, and that he was still there, warm and alive beside her. And so, in the dark of that small apartment, with the city humming faintly beyond the window, Hannah let her eyes close and let the strange, quiet miracle of it settle, unexamined, into the hours before dawn. Let that moment rest now, just as it was. There is no need to hurry away from it, no need to make sense of it all at once. We stay with them a little longer, in the quiet that comes after, letting the weight of what happened settle like dust after footsteps have passed. If you feel your eyes growing heavy, that is all right. Let them close for a moment. Let your breath slow in and out, unhurried. The night is still gentle around us, and the story has not finished with them yet. There's more to come, more of this same night unfolding in its own soft time, but none of it needs your full attention right now. Just rest here in the pause and let the next part arrive on its own whenever you are ready to drift toward it. Before long, Hannah had stopped turning on the lamp when she came home late because the dark seemed to belong to this now, whatever this was. She would ease the door shut behind her, feel her way past the low table without knocking her shin on it more than once, and lower herself onto the futon beside the small warm shape already waiting there. Tama. That was all she needed to say most nights, and then she would wait the way you wait for a kettle you already know is about to sing. His voice, when it came, was low and unhurried, a little rough at the edges, the voice of someone who had seen a great deal and was in no hurry to explain any of it. Some nights he only wanted to complain, gently, about the long-haired cat 2 wards down, who he said had never once shared his sunny spot on the windowsill in all the weeks they had lived on the same hallway. Other nights, he was kinder than she expected, telling her, without her even asking, that the little dog with the bad heart down the hall would be fine, would go home within the week, and that she should stop lying awake worrying about it. He was right, as it turned out. Short. And that was the strange shape her days had taken by then. That she would go to work and watch the ordinary business of the hospital unfold exactly as a cat on her futon had already told her at midnight that it would. She never told anyone this, not her parents, not the 2 or 3 friends she still found time for, because there was no way to say it out loud that did not sound like the beginning of a story about a young woman who badly needed some rest. But it wasn't only the small things, the windowsill, the dog's prognosis, the food she bought him, which he told her flatly was not very good, whatever the price on the bag suggested. Night after night, in that same unhurried voice, Tama told her things about the hospital that she had no way of knowing, and at first, no way at all of checking. He knew who propped the back door open on hot afternoons for the strays that gathered near the bins, and who complained loudest about it the next morning. Short, he knew which nurse hummed, low and tuneless, to the animals coming out of anesthesia, and which one moved through the recovery ward without ever once saying a name out loud. He told her one night that the young technician who always seemed short-tempered by the front desk was only frightened of the older doctors and cried sometimes in her car before her shift, though nobody there had ever seen it. Hannah lay in the dark and listened the way a child listens to a bedtime story she already half suspects. Somewhere underneath the listening might turn out to be true. And then one night, without any particular weight in his voice, as though it were no more remarkable than the business of the windowsill, Tama told her about the woman who fed them their breakfast every morning, the one in the white coat, the one all the animals seemed to like. He said her name was Rin, and that Rin smoked inside the building in one of the back rooms with the door pulled shut behind her. Hannah went very still in the dark when she heard that. She knew Rin, of course. Short. Rin had been at the hospital for nearly 10 years by then, long before Hannah had ever set foot in the place, and she wore that seniority the way some people wear a favorite old coat, comfortably, without giving much thought to who else was in the room. Rin was kind to Hannah, in her own brisk, busy way, the way of someone who has trained a great many young vets before her and doesn't especially expect this one to last much longer than the rest. It was hard to picture her doing something so plainly careless in a building full of animals on oxygen, animals whose lungs were the one thing everyone there had sworn, in some form or other, to protect. A cat's word was not evidence, Hannah told herself, turning the thought over in the dark as if she could wear it smooth. Short, and yet the smaller things he'd told her, the windowsill, the dog, the technician crying quietly in her car, had all turned out to be true, one after another, without exception, and that was a hard fact to simply set aside. So the next afternoon, in a lull between appointments, Hannah found a reason to linger in the back corridor near the supply closets, holding a clipboard she didn't really need, the way people do when they want to look as though they belong somewhere they're only loitering. The corridor smelled the way it always did back there, of antiseptic and old paper and the particular staleness of a building with no windows that opened. And under the fluorescent lights, everything looked a little too bright for the hour. She waited. Short. 15 minutes passed, and nothing happened, and she began to feel foolish standing there with her clipboard, doubting a cat, and then doubting herself for doubting a cat. In that order, and then the other way around. Then the door to the small staff room at the end of the hall opened and shut again, quietly, the way a door closes when someone doesn't want its closing to be noticed. It was Rin. Short. Hannah didn't follow right away. Short. She counted slowly to 10, the old habit of a childhood counting game, and then she walked quietly and without hurrying toward that same door and eased it open just far enough to see inside. Rin was standing by the small window at the back of the room, the one that didn't open either, with a cigarette between two fingers and a thin ribbon of smoke rising past her face, close enough to the oxygen lines in the next room that something cold settled low in Hannah's stomach. Rin looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Then Rin admitted, quietly, that she'd only meant to have the one, that it had been a long week, and asked Hannah, in a voice that had lost all its usual briskness, please not to make a great deal out of it. Hannah didn't sleep well that night. Not because Tama had anything new to tell her, but because of what she now had to decide to do with what she already knew. It would have been easy, she thought, to let it go the way people let so many small wrong things go, because Rin was senior and tired and not, underneath it, a cruel person, only a careless one on one bad afternoon. But there were animals down that hall breathing through tubes, animals with no way of choosing where they were kept and no way of asking to be kept somewhere safer. And it was that thought, in the end, that settled it for her. The next morning, before her shift properly began, Hannah said what she had seen, plainly and only the once, to the senior doctor who ran the place. And then she went and did her rounds and tried not to think too hard about what would happen next. Nothing happened in a hurry. Short. There was a quiet conversation somewhere behind a closed door, the kind Hannah was not invited to and did not ask to hear, and for a day or two the hospital carried on exactly as it always had, animals arriving, animals going home, the kettle in the break room boiling itself dry at least once, the way it always did. But Rin grew quieter around her after that. Not unkind, only quieter, the way people go quiet around someone who has seen a thing about them they never chose to show. And then, only days later, Rin gave her notice. Short, nobody made a great event of it. Short, there was a small gathering near the front desk on our last afternoon. Someone had bought a cake that turned out to be slightly too sweet, and Rin smiled through most of it in the tired, practiced way of someone who has said 100 goodbyes in that same corridor and knows exactly how they go. She shook Hannah's hand on the way out and said, without any bitterness in it that Hannah could find, that she hoped the animals would be in good hands now. Hannah said that she hoped so too, and meant it, and that was the last time she ever saw her. She went home that evening feeling strange about the whole thing, not proud exactly, and not sorry either, just strange, the way a person feels after doing something necessary that still cost somebody else something real. She sat down on the futon in the dark, the way she did every night now, and told Tama, quietly, that Rin was gone. He was quiet himself for a moment, which was unusual for him. And when he finally spoke, it was gentler than she expected, almost careful. He told her that she hadn't done anything wrong, that the animals down that hall would breathe a little easier now, whether or not anyone ever thought to thank her for it. And he added, in that same unhurried voice, that being right about a hard thing rarely feels the way people imagine it will, warm and satisfying, like a job well finished. Mostly, he said, it just feels quiet, short. Then, after a silence long enough that she thought he was done for the night, he spoke again, lower than before, about things she had never asked him about. He told her that the old woman had not left him behind the way she believed, that a person could run out of money and still be full of love, and that letting him go had been her last way of saving him. And he told her that the boss she spent so much of her strength disliking was not so bad a man as she had decided, and that she ought to look at him properly, the way she looked at her patients, before she made up her mind for good. Hannah held that in the dark without answering, half believing him and half unable to, because it is one thing to be told a hard man has a soft center, and another thing entirely to see it. Hannah lay back and let that settle over her for a while, the lamp still off, the tatami cool beneath her hand, the small warm weight of him shifting closer, somewhere near her side. Outside, faintly, the last train of the night went by somewhere beyond the building, and for a long while after that, neither of them said anything else. The hospital would be different in small ways after this. She supposed a little safer down that one back hallway, a little quieter at the front desk where Rin used to sit and wave people through. But mostly, for Hannah, what stayed with her was simpler than any of that. Somewhere in the dark of her own small apartment, a cat she had once thought she was only keeping alive out of stubbornness had turned out, night after night, to be the one telling her who to trust. And for one night, at least, that felt like answer enough, and she let her eyes finally close. Let that moment rest now, just as it was. There's no need to hurry past it. No need to hold on to it too tightly, either. It can simply settle the way a held breath settles once it is finally let go. We stay with them a little longer here in the quiet that follows, and you are welcome to rest here too, however heavy your eyes have become. The night is not finished with them yet, and it does not need to be finished all at once. If you take a slow breath now, in through the nose and out long and easy, you may notice how naturally your body wants to sink further into wherever you are lying. Nothing is required of you. The story continues to unfold at its own unhurried pace, and so does the rest that is already beginning to find you, wave by wave, slower now, softer now, carrying you gently onward into what comes next. In a small apartment on a quiet street, a young vet named Hannah had learned that if she wanted her cat Tama to speak with her, she first had to turn off every light in the room. It was a small ritual by now, 7 nights old, and it went almost the same way each time. She would set down her bag by the door, warm a little rice for herself, and sit on the tatami beside the low cushion where Tama rested, his thin body wrapped in the soft gray blanket she had bought him that first week. The apartment smelled the way it always did in the evenings, of straw matting and last night's tea, and somewhere below the window a bicycle bell rang twice and then went quiet. Then she would reach up and switch off the lamp, and the room would go the kind of dark that seemed, for reasons she never once understood, to loosen something in the old cat's throat. Only then, in that dark, would Tama begin to talk. She had stopped being afraid of it by the 3rd night, though she still sometimes laughed out loud at herself, alone in the dark, listening to a 19-year-old American short-hair discuss her life with more patience than anyone else ever had. He had opinions about almost everything, and he shared them the way an old man shares them, unhurried, a little dry, never once raising his voice. He told her about the hospital, about people she thought she understood and did not, and about the particular tiredness he could smell on her when she came home some evenings and thought she had hidden it well. But it was on the 4th night, when she came in soaked from a rain she hadn't dressed for and sat down without even taking off her wet socks, that Tama first spoke to her about the things she carried. "You hold too much," he told her, in that low, unbothered voice of his, the way another cat might comment on the weather. "Every animal that dies on your table, you carry it out the door with you," he said, "and you never once put it down." Hannah hadn't known what to say to that, so she had said nothing and only listened to the rain finish its work on the window. She thought of the dog from that morning, the one she hadn't been able to save, and felt for the first time in weeks that someone had actually noticed the weight of it and not just the fact of it. "We are stronger than you think we are," Tama told her some nights later when she had come home defeated over that very case and hadn't touched her rice at all. "Don't feel sorry for us," he said. "We're not sad the way you imagine. Most of us are happy, right up until we aren't, and that is more than a lot of you get." He said it so plainly, so without any weight behind it, that she found herself believing him before she had even decided to. "You people are always in such a hurry." He mentioned once, half asleep, one paw twitching at some private dream. "Slow down. Nothing is chasing you the way you think it is." And she would lie there on the tatami in the dark, her knees pulled up, and let the words settle over her like the blanket she'd never quite gotten around to washing. He was not always gentle about it. Not in the soft way people mean when they say gentle, and some nights his honesty had an edge on it that surprised her. Don't rescue us out of some fancy that passes through you. He said once, there are animals out there who would be happier if it were over, and pretending otherwise doesn't help them. The world is unkind sometimes, and that unkindness is just true. He told her, go and look properly at the sunset instead of looking away from it. You want to be like that sunset, don't you? He asked without really asking, the way he did most things. She had gone quiet at that one because it was true, and because she hadn't known a cat could see that far into a person. You know things, he told her another night, but you mistake knowing for understanding, and they are not the same animal at all. There are things you cannot see, he said, and the things you cannot see are exactly the ones worth paying attention to. Go for a walk sometime, just to walk, he told her once, not to get anywhere. And she had actually laughed at the idea of an old cat prescribing her a cure for her own restlessness. He was right about that too, though it would take her longer than a week to admit it. There was a night too, when she asked him, half joking, whether he minded the smell of the hospital on her hands, and he told her that people worried far too much about what animals minded, and far too little about what animals felt. We feel plenty, he said, we just don't make a performance of it the way you do. And there was no scolding in it, only a kind of tired affection. Another night he asked her, almost lazily, why she kept apologizing to the animals on her table before she had even done anything wrong, and she found she didn't have a real answer for him. You apologize because you're afraid, he told her, and fear makes for careful hands, so maybe don't stop entirely, but stop carrying it home with you every night the way you do. He said this while grooming one paw with the unhurried thoroughness of an old cat who had never once in his life felt the need to hurry through anything, and somehow that made it land even softer. She began, without quite noticing, to leave a little more of the day at the hospital door and to bring a little more of herself home instead, and it felt, at first, almost like cheating. In the daylight hours, in the ordinary business of the hospital, she watched people around her and understood, slowly, that Tama had already told her everything about them that mattered, in his own unhurried way, long before she worked it out herself. She stopped arguing with him after the first few nights because there was nothing in his voice that asked to be argued with, only a kind of settled patience that made her want to sit very still and listen. He never once told her that things would be easy, and she can be grateful for that, because so much of what she heard from people who meant well was exactly that, and none of it had ever helped. What he gave her instead was smaller and somehow sturdier, a way of setting one day down before she picked up the next, and she found that she needed it more than she had known. By the sixth night, she had begun to notice that his voice, though never anything but calm, had grown a little thinner at the edges, the way a sound grows thin when it is traveling a longer distance to reach you. She did not let herself think too hard about what that might mean, and told herself instead that he was simply tired, the way any 19-year-old body gets tired, and left it there. It was on the seventh night, though she did not yet know it was the last one, that something in the room felt different before he had even spoken a word. The rain had stopped some time after dark, and the apartment held that particular hush that comes after rain, when even the pipes in the wall seemed to be listening. Hannah had switched off the lamp as she always did and sat down on the cushion beside him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Tama's breathing was slower than it had been the night before, a small, careful sound, and she found herself matching her own breath to it without quite deciding to. Then, in the dark, he told her that he was grateful to her, in a voice that had none of its usual dryness left in it, only a plain and open warmth. "Thank you for taking care of me," he said, and he said it slowly, the way a person says something they have been holding on to for a while and finally allow themselves to put down. She felt her chest go tight, and she reached out in the dark until her hand found the soft, worn fur along his back, and she left it there. He did not move away from her hand, which he almost never allowed, and that alone told her something her ears hadn't caught yet. "Be happy," he told her, and that was all. Two small words offered the way he offered everything, without any drama attached to them, as if happiness were simply the next sensible thing on the list. She wanted to ask him what he meant, whether he meant happy tonight, or happy this year, or happy in some larger sense she wasn't ready to hear, but her voice didn't come. So instead she just kept her hand where it was, feeling the small rise and fall under her palm, and let the silence hold both of them the way the dark had been holding them all week. She would think, much later, that there had been no fear in him at all that night, none of the bracing she might have expected from anyone, animal or otherwise, who somehow knew what was coming. There was only that plain gratitude, offered once and not repeated, the way a person says a true thing exactly once because saying it twice would cheapen it. She stayed there a long while after he had gone quiet, listening to the small, ordinary sounds of the apartment, the refrigerator's hum, a train somewhere far off, her own pulse slowing to match his. Eventually his breathing eased into sleep or something like it, and Hannah sat with him a long while after that, not moving, not wanting to be the one who left the room first. She did not sleep much herself, not because she was afraid, but because some part of her understood that a night like this one deserved to be stayed awake for. Somewhere near dawn, she must have drifted off anyway, her hand still resting on the blanket, her back against the cool wall, because the next thing she knew the light outside had changed. In the morning, the light came in pale and unremarkable through the paper screen, the ordinary gray light of a Tokyo morning after rain, and Tama was gone. He had died sometime in those quiet hours, curled into the same soft blanket, his body settled in a way that held no struggle in it anywhere. There was no sound that had woken her, no last cry, nothing that asked anything of her at all, only the stillness of a small body that had simply, finally, stopped needing to carry itself any further. She sat with him a long time before she called anyone, before she did anything that the world would have called practical, because some moments are not meant to be rushed through toward the next one. She found herself thinking about the rice she had warmed for him the night before, rice he had barely touched, and how she would keep that memory long after she had forgotten most of the harder days at the hospital. She thought, too, of everything he had told her across those 7 nights, the sunsets she hadn't looked at, the walks she still hadn't taken, the weight she had been asked gently to set down. A week, she thought, just 1 week, and somehow it had reordered everything she believed about her work and about herself and about what it meant to sit beside something that was hurting. She would tell people about it later, and most of them would laugh gently, the way people laugh at things they cannot quite let themselves believe. But she had stopped needing anyone to believe her, because the proof of it was not in the talking cat at all. Not really. It was in the woman she had slowly become while she listened to him. She did not carry every loss out the door with her anymore. Not the way she once had, because an old cat had told her plainly in the dark that she was allowed to set some of it down. She wrapped him gently in the blanket he had died in, because it seemed wrong, somehow, to separate him from the one soft thing he had kept close all week, and she carried him the way you carry something you intend to remember carrying. Outside, the street was waking up in its ordinary way, a delivery truck idling somewhere, a shutter going up 2 doors down, none of it pausing for what had happened in this one small room. She found that she did not mind the ordinariness of it, that in fact she was glad of it, glad the world kept moving in its plain, unhurried rhythm exactly the way he had always told her it should. And so, on that quiet gray morning, with the rain finished and the apartment very still, Hannah held what was left of Tama a little while longer and let herself be glad, in the smallest and truest way, that she had been the one he chose to tell. Let that moment rest now, just as it is. We don't need to rush away from it, and we don't need to explain it any further tonight. Let it settle quietly, the way a held breath finally lets go. We stay with them a little longer in that same night, in that same unhurried air before the story continues to carry them forward. If your eyes have already closed, that's all right. You can let the rest of this drift past you like something half heard, half dreamed. Take a slow breath in and a slower one out. There is no hurry here. The night goes on, and so do they, gently, into what comes next. In the still back ward of the University Animal Hospital, on the quiet edge of Tokyo, a young vet named Hannah sat alone on a low stool, early on a gray morning before opening hours, with a soft blanket bundled in her arms. Inside the blanket was Tama, the old American short hair everyone at the hospital had come to know in these last few weeks, and Tama was not sleeping anymore. He had been a small cat for 19 years, more bone than body by then, his coat a tired, faded silver, his ears gone thin and soft with age. He had gone quietly at her apartment, sometime in the night, just past, the way these things sometimes happen, without struggle, without so much as a sound. She could still feel, faintly, the last of his warmth coming through the wool. Hannah had carried him back to the clinic herself, wrapped just like this, because she hadn't known what else a person was supposed to do with a body that still felt so much like him. The waiting room lights were off, and only the small lamp at the reception desk still burned, throwing a low yellow circle across the linoleum floor. Down the hall, the refrigerator that held the vaccines hummed to itself, steady and indifferent, the only sound in the whole building. She kept thinking about the night before, when Tama had told her, in that low, private voice only she seemed able to hear, that he was grateful to her, and that she should be happy. His voice had sounded unhurried that night, almost as if he were talking half inside a dream, and she had somehow assumed, foolishly, that there would be more nights like it. There weren't. It was such a small thing for him to have said, and she had not stopped turning it over since, the way a person turns a stone in their pocket without quite meaning to. She did not hear the door at the far end of the hall open, or the slow, unhurried footsteps that came down it toward her. Kenji, the senior vet who ran the place, found her there still in his coat and slippers, having come back in for something he'd forgotten, and he did not look surprised to see her. He was 10 years older than Hannah, with the kind of tired, unimpressed face that made new clients nervous and made the staff, secretly, trust him more than anyone else in the building. He looked at the blanket in her arms for a moment, and then at her face, and something in his own expression softened, just slightly, just for a second. He didn't ask what had happened, because he could see it well enough on his own, and instead he went straight to the little back office and put the kettle on. Hannah followed him without being asked to, still holding Tama, and sat down across the narrow table from her boss for what felt like the first honest conversation the two of them had ever had. The staff office was small and a little shabby, with textbooks stacked sideways on open shelves and a calendar 3 months out of date pinned crookedly to the wall. A corkboard by the door was thick with old invoices and reminder slips, the ordinary paperwork of a place that had to keep its lights on somehow. Kenji poured instant coffee into 2 chipped mugs without bothering to ask whether she wanted any, and set one down in front of her, the steam curling up between them. He told her, in that flat, unbothered voice of his, that she had done a foolish thing, taking that cat on for free, and that she had known it was foolish even while she was doing it. Hannah didn't argue, because there wasn't really anything to argue with, and she found herself thinking that maybe this was simply what the truth sounded like, out loud, in the first gray light of morning. But then Kenji did something he rarely did, and admitted almost reluctantly that he probably would have done the same thing himself 20 years earlier, before the business had worn certain things out of him. He said it quietly, almost to the mug in his own hands rather than to her. And Hannah found that harder to hear than any scolding could have been. He told her that she needed to understand something now, while she was still new enough for it to matter, because no one had been kind enough to tell it to him back when he'd needed it. Most sick animals, he said, never make it through a hospital door at all. Not because people don't love them, he told her, but because loving an animal and being able to pay for its treatment turn out to be 2 very different things. He said that for every cat like Tama who reached an exam table, there were a dozen more curled up somewhere in some apartment, quietly getting worse, simply because the money wasn't there. It wasn't cruelty most of the time, he said. It was rent and a child's school fees and a bad month at work and an animal that had no way of explaining how much it hurt. He reminded her that things had gotten better than they used to be, that people spent far more on their pets now than his own parents' generation ever had. But better, he said, was not the same as enough. There were still more owners than she'd want to believe, he told her, who simply did not think an animal's life was worth very much money at all. And however hard the 2 of them worked, however many extra hours they put in, that particular fact about people was not going to change, not because of anything a vet could do about it. So the abandoned ones kept coming, he said, and the neglected ones kept coming. And there was no version of this job where a person got to save every last one of them. He said it without any real anger in his voice, which surprised her more than the words themselves did, as though he had simply run out of anger about it a long time ago. Hannah asked him quietly whether that meant they were supposed to stop caring, stop feeling any of it, the way he sometimes seemed to when a case went badly. Kenji shook his head slowly at that. He said that wasn't at all, and that if he had truly stopped feeling it, he would have quit this work a long time ago. What it meant, he told her, was that the hospital had to still be standing tomorrow, and the month after that, and the year after that, for any of the caring to be worth anything. A clinic that gave everything away for free, he said, was a clinic that closed within the year, and a closed clinic couldn't help anyone at all, not even for one more afternoon. He wanted to help every animal that came through that door. He admitted, more than she probably realized, watching him bark about invoices and antibiotics all day long. But he had learned the hard way that wanting to help wasn't the same as being able to, and that treatment cost money whether or not the story behind it happened to be a sad one. In the end, he told her, it was always the owner who paid the bill. And so, whether anyone liked it or not, it was always the owner who decided whether an animal lived or died. Not the vet. Never the vet. However much the vet might wish it were otherwise, sitting up all night with some strange, talkative old cat that wasn't even hers to save. He said this last part almost gently, glancing at the blanket still resting in her lap. And for a moment his tired face looked almost regretful, the way a face looks when a fact has cost the person something to say out loud. Hannah looked down at Tama and thought of the unpaid bill still sitting somewhere in a folder in the front office, and of the elderly woman who had never come back for him. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she couldn't be angry at her either. She understood, in a way she hadn't fully understood before that night, that whoever had brought this cat and had probably loved him exactly as much as she did, and simply hadn't had the money left to prove it. That was the part nobody had told her in school, she realized. This job wasn't only medicine. It turned out it was sitting quietly in the gap between what an animal needed and what a person could actually afford to give it. Kenji told her that if she wanted to be the kind of vet she dreamed of becoming since she was a little girl, gentle to every last creature that came through that door, she was first going to have to survive long enough to keep being that vet. And surviving, in this particular line of work, meant learning to hold both things at once, the softness and the arithmetic, without letting either one win completely. He didn't say any of it unkindly. If anything, he said it like a man finally setting down something heavy he had been carrying alone for a long time, glad for once to share the weight of it with someone. Hannah sat with that for a while, turning her coffee mug slowly in both hands, listening to the kettle tick softly as it cooled on the hot plate behind them. She thought about how, only a week before, she had hated this man for saying almost exactly these same things, and how she still didn't fully agree with him, and yet, somehow, could no longer call him wrong. Outside the small office window, the city was doing what it always did at that early hour. A few taxi headlights sliding past on asphalt still wet from the night's rain. Kenji told her, more gently than she expected, that Tama had gotten a better week because of what she had done, whatever the ledger said about it, and that this part, at least, nobody could ever take back. He said that grieving one animal you couldn't keep forever wasn't a failure of professionalism. Whatever he might grumble about on an ordinary Tuesday, it was simply the tax this work quietly charged every single time without exception. Hannah found herself thinking that she would remember this particular conversation longer than most of what she had learned across 4 years of veterinary school. Not because it was comforting exactly, but because it was true, and because Kenji, of all the times he might have chosen to say it, had chosen to say it kindly. She looked down once more at Tama, quiet now in her arms, and let herself accept, slowly, the way a person accepts cold water, that she would carry cats like this one for the rest of her career and would not always get to keep them. Kenji finished his coffee, rinsed both mugs in the small office sink, and told her that they would see to Tama's arrangements properly once the day had begun. For now, he said she should just sit with him a while longer if that was what she needed. Then he switched off the harsh overhead light, leaving only the desk lamp burning, and told her on his way out that it never really got easier exactly, but that a person did get steadier if they let themselves. Hannah sat alone again in the small pool of lamplight, the last of the night's rain still beating on the window glass, and for the first time all week, the tears that finally came did not feel quite so much like defeat. And somewhere underneath the tiredness and the ache of it, something in her had quietly settled into place, the way a coat settles onto the shoulders once you stop fighting the weight of it. She would carry both things from now on, she thought, the softness and the arithmetic, all the way through whatever years of this work were still ahead of her. And that, for now, felt like enough of an answer to rest on. Let that moment rest for now, exactly as it was, without needing to be finished or explained any further tonight. Some feelings arrive slowly, and this one can simply stay where it landed, held gently, while the night continues to move around it at its own unhurried pace. If your eyes have already closed, that is all right. You have not missed anything, and nothing more will be asked of you than to keep breathing slowly, in and out, like a tide easing back from the shore. The story has not ended. It is only settling, the way a house settles quietly after everyone inside has finally grown still, and we stay close to them a little longer as the night goes on. Months after the old cat had gone quiet in her hands, on a mild evening at the small animal hospital, a Shih Tzu named Kuro lay curled on the steel examination table, waiting, without knowing it, for the kindest thing anyone could still do for him. He was only 6, though his heart had been tired since he was a puppy, a small crooked engine that had never once kept proper time. Hannah had known him for most of those 6 years. The frequent visits, the seizures that arrived without warning and left him panting and confused on the waiting room floor, and the voice of his owner, Mr. Morita, on the phone a little more worn with each call. She remembered him as a puppy too, small enough to fit inside a jacket pocket, so full of nervous energy that nobody in the clinic had believed back then that his heart was the part of him working hardest to keep up. That day the seizures had come 3 times before noon, and by the third one Mr. Morita had said, very quietly, that he could not do this anymore, that he could not sit and watch Kuro shake like that and call it love. If it had to end, he said, then let it end here gently, and let it be someone kind who did it. There was a form of sign, a short one, the kind that always feels far too short for what it is asking of a person. He signed it standing at the counter, without sitting down first, as though sitting might make the whole evening too real to survive. He asked only that someone call him once it was finished, and then he left before the ink had properly dried, because some goodbyes a person can only manage if they do not have to watch the end of them. The door swung shut behind him, and the little bell above it rang once, brightly, into a waiting room that now felt far too quiet for a bell that cheerful. Outside, the evening traffic went on the way it always did, headlights sliding along the wet road, entirely unaware that anything in the building had just changed. Hannah stood there with the clipboard still in her hand for a moment. She had been a licensed vet for less than a year by then, and no one had taught her, not really, what to do with a room after an owner walks out of it without his dog. Kuro lifted his head toward the closing door for a second, the way dogs do when they have heard a familiar step leave and are still deciding whether to believe it. And then he set his head back down on the blanket. He did not bark. He only breathed, slow and a little uneven, the small sound of him filling up the room the way a kettle does before it decides whether to whistle. Hannah sat beside him for a while, one hand resting on the soft fur between his shoulders, not doing anything useful, just staying, because staying seemed to be the only medicine she had left to offer him that evening. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and, underneath that, of the coffee someone had left cooling by the sink, 2 ordinary smells that had no business being part of an evening like this one. She found herself thinking about how unfair the whole arrangement was, that an animal could spend 6 years loving somebody with his entire small body and then spend his last hour in a room with people he had only ever known for 10 minutes at a time. It was nearly 7 when Kenji came in, still in his white coat, smelling faintly of the coffee he drank too much of and never seemed to enjoy. He did not say much at first, only looked over the chart, the years of visits, the medications, the little handwritten notes some previous vet had left about how Kuro liked to be held with his back leg supported. Hannah had expected him to be brisk about it, the way he was brisk about almost everything, because Kenji was the one who was always reminding her that a hospital could not run on kindness alone, that somebody had to keep the lights on. But he set the chart down slowly, rolled his sleeve back out of habit, and pulled the little stool over so that he was sitting almost at Kuro's eye level, which was not a thing she had ever seen him do for a bill or a budget. He rested one hand flat on the table beside the dog, not quite touching him yet, and for a moment he simply looked at Kuro the way you might look at someone you already knew you were going to miss. The lamp on the counter threw a small, warm circle of light over the two of them, and everything past its edge, the cabinets, the scale, the rest of the room, seemed to soften and fall back in a shadow, as if it understood it was not needed just then. Then, in a voice Hannah had never once heard him use in the front office. Low and unhurried, Kenji began talking to the dog as though the two of them had known each other far longer than a chart could ever say. He told Kuro that people were selfish creatures, in their way, loving an animal with their whole hearts for years, and then finding at the very end that they did not have it in them to watch the last of it. He said that it was not really fair to ask a dog to understand that, and that Kuro did not have to try. He admitted in that same quiet voice that he was the one who had to do this because it was his job and because somebody kind had to be the one in the room even when the somebody who loved you most could not manage to stay in it. He told Kuro that he might not be enough, that he was not the one who had raised him or fed him or slept with him at the foot of a bed for 6 years, but that he would still stay and watch and see the whole of it through to the end. He told Kuro that he was sorry it had come to this, sorry that a small dog with a tired heart had spent more of his 6 years frightened and shaking than he had spent chasing anything, or sleeping in a warm patch of sun, or doing whatever it is dogs do when nothing at all is wrong with them. He said he was sorry they had not been able to fix him, and that this was the part of the job nobody ever warned you about in school, the part where you had done everything you knew how to do, and it still was not enough. For a moment, he was quiet, just resting his hand a little closer to the dog's paw, and Hannah realized she was holding her own breath without having decided to. Then his voice softened even further, down into something Hannah could barely hear over the hum of the light above them. And he told Kuro that he did not have to be brave anymore, that the trying was over now, that he could finally just rest. He said, half to the dog and half to no one at all, that if there was any justice in how these things worked, Kuro would come back next time as a person, so that somebody could finally love him the way he deserved, all the way to the end, and not just most of the way there. And then, so softly that Hannah almost missed it, he told Kuro that the two of them would share a good drink together someday, somewhere, and that this was a promise, and that he meant to keep it. Hannah stood very still by the counter through all of this, watching a man she had spent a year quietly disliking speak to a dying dog with more tenderness than she had ever heard him spend on a living person. She thought of all the times she had rolled her eyes at him for talking about margins and overhead and the cost of antibiotics, and she felt something in her chest come slightly undone. It occurred to her, standing there, that a man could believe a hospital had to survive as a business and still, when it mattered, set that belief down on the floor beside him and simply be kind. She had been taught, somewhere in the last few months, that an animal in its final moments can feel the fear of the people around it, that a shaking hand or a held breath travels somehow into the room and into the patient, and that the kindest thing you can give a dying animal is your own calm. So she made herself breathe slowly, and she kept her hands steady on the edge of the table, and she did not let the tears that were already gathering behind her eyes go any further than that. Kenji drew up the medicine without any hurry at all, checking it twice out of habit rather than doubt, and Hannah held Kuro's head gently between her palms, the same way she might have held something she had been asked to keep perfectly safe. Kuro's breathing had already gone soft, and even by then, almost sleepy, as if some of what Kenji had said to him had actually landed somewhere and settled. The needle went in without any fuss, and Kenji kept talking under his breath the whole time. Small, ordinary things now. That he was a good dog, that this would not hurt, that it was almost done. Kuro's eyes stayed on Kenji's face for a little while, the way a dog's eyes will find the one steady thing in a room, and then very gently they closed. His breathing slowed and slowed again, and then without any struggle at all, it simply was not there anymore. The way a candle in a still room stops being lit and nobody could say exactly which second it happened. The hum of the light above them seemed louder for a moment, the way ordinary sounds do once a bigger sound has gone out of a room. Kenji sat with his hand on the dog's back for a moment longer than the job strictly required, and Hannah understood, watching him, that this stillness afterward was also part of what he thought the job was. Neither of them spoke for a while. Hannah found that her own hands were still steady, which surprised her because everything underneath them was not steady at all. She thought, in the quiet that followed, that she had spent a year believing kindness and professionalism lived on opposite sides of a room, and that she had just watched a man hold both of them at once without appearing to notice the effort. It was some time later, after Kuro had been settled onto a soft blanket in the quiet back room, his paws tucked in as though he had simply chosen a comfortable way to sleep, that Mr. Morita returned to collect him. He came in with his coat still buttoned against the evening air, and for a moment he simply stood in the doorway, as though some part of him had hoped that walking in slowly might change what he would find. When he saw the small, still shape on the blanket, the sound that came out of him was not really a word at all, just grief with no more patience left for form. And he cried the way people cry when they've been holding something in for hours out of politeness and finally cannot anymore. Hannah felt her own throat tighten at the sound of it, because there is very little in the world lonelier than a person crying over a goodbye they arranged themselves and then could not bear to attend. Kenji did not rush to comfort him, and he did not raise his voice either, but he said, in a tone that was steady rather than angry, that tears were something a person had to earn by staying in the room, and that Kuro had done all of his crying alone with two people who were near enough strangers to him. It was not said cruelly, Hannah thought later, only plainly, the way a person says a true thing they have decided somebody needs to hear, even if it costs them something to say it. Mr. Morita did not argue with him. He only nodded and wiped his face with the back of his sleeve and knelt down beside the blanket for a long while, saying quietly to Kuro all the things he had perhaps meant to say out loud for 6 years and never quite had the courage to. Hannah stepped back into the hallway to give him that much privacy and stood there with Kenji in the dim light near the supply cabinet, neither of them saying anything for a minute or two. Through the half-open door, she could still hear the low murmur of Mr. Morita's voice, gentler now, the kind of voice a person uses when they're finally saying the important things a little too late, and even too late it seemed to matter. She found herself thinking that she had come to this hospital wanting to save every animal that walked through its doors, and it's been a year quietly grieving the fact that the world would not let her. But watching Kenji that evening, she understood something gentler than either of the two ideas she had been carrying around, the dreamer's and the businessman's, which was that sometimes the kindest thing a vet can do is simply not look away when everybody else already has. She glanced at Kenji once in that dim hallway and thought that he looked, for just a moment, like a much older and much more tired man than the one who complained every morning about the price of antibiotics. Later, walking home under a sky on the soft gray of a nearly finished evening, Hannah thought about the promise Kenji had made to a dog who could never hold him to it, and found that she believed him anyway. She thought that perhaps that was the quiet difference between a person who only pretended to be hard and a person who had simply learned the slow and expensive way, which parts of himself he could afford to let the world see. And that perhaps is as much as anyone needs to understand about the kind of man Kenji really was underneath the coffee and the talk of overhead. And it is where this quiet part of the story comes gently to rest. Let that moment rest now, soft and unhurried, the way a held breath finally lets go. There's no need to follow it any further tonight. We can simply stay here a little longer, letting the quiet settle around it like a blanket pulled up to the chin. If your eyes have already closed, that is all right. The story does not need you awake to keep unfolding. Somewhere close by, in that same night, another thread of it is still moving gently forward, patient and unbothered by the hour. Take a slow breath in and let it out even slower. There is nowhere to rush to. The night holds everything that comes next, and it will still be there, waiting, soft and low, whenever you are ready to drift with it. In a small clinic on a quiet side street, a young vet named Hannah stood at the front counter after closing time, one hand resting lightly over her stomach, waiting for the last of the evening light to fade from the frosted glass of the door. The clinic was hers now, hers and Kenji's together, two names stenciled side by side on a plain wooden sign out front. And most nights it still smelled faintly of antiseptic and of the cheap green tea they kept warming in a chipped pot by the sink. On the windowsill behind her, in the last patch of lamplight, a young tabby named Muji lay curled with his paws tucked under him. Barely 2 years old, still young enough to sleep with one ear tilted toward the room, as though the world might yet do something worth waking for. Somewhere in the back room, Kenji was turning off the sterilizer and humming something tuneless under his breath, the way he always did on a day when nobody's pet had died on the table, and Hannah had learned, over the years, to listen for that particular sound and feel her own shoulders come down. She thought of a new life they had learned about only a few days before, far too small yet to feel, and she let out a breath she hadn't noticed she was holding and pressed her palm a little flatter against the quiet of it. It was early days still, and the clinic's little waiting room, with its two mismatched chairs and its stack of dog-eared magazines, had started to feel less like a business she was still learning to run and more like a house they were slowly filling. Money was tight, the way it had always been tight, the way Kenji liked to joke that it would probably always be tight for two vets who could never quite bring themselves to charge what the textbook said they should. But it was theirs. Kenji came out from the back room, still in his scrubs, wiping his hands on a towel, and instead of heading for the light switch, he crossed the windowsill and crouched down in front of Muji, the way he did most evenings now, whether or not there was any real reason for it. He told the cat, in the low, half-serious voice he used only for this, that Nikomata were said to find their voices at 15, and that 13 years was not so very long to wait, and that a cat who meant to talk one day had better arrive with a decent vocabulary. So every evening, more or less, he ran through a short list of words for Muji's benefit. Mostly nonsense, mostly things he found funny to say out loud to an animal who gave no sign of listening, and Hannah had stopped a long time ago, finding this strange. Muji only blinked at him, slow and unbothered, and flexed one paw, and did not say a single word, which by now was such a familiar disappointment that it barely felt like one at all. Kenji straightened up with a small groan about his knees and said, mostly to himself, that he'd like to meet a Nikomata again someday. A cat who'd lived long enough and seen enough to earn a second tail and a voice of his own. And Hannah smiled without quite meaning to. She had heard him say some version of that line, perhaps 100 times by now, and it never once sounded like he expected an answer. It was strange, she thought, watching him crouch there talking softly to a young cat in an empty clinic, to remember how much she had once disliked him. 8 years ago, fresh out of school with her license barely dry, she had stood in a very different clinic, a bigger one, university run, and listened to this same man tell her more than once that being a vet was a business first and a kindness second, and that sentiment was a luxury the ledgers didn't allow. She had hated him for that, quietly and thoroughly, the way only a very young idealist can hate someone who sounds infuriatingly like he might be right. She had wanted, back then, to be the gentle vet of her childhood daydreams, the one who saved everything, who never let a bill get in the way of a life. And Kenji's talk of profit margins and pointless medications had felt like a betrayal of everything she'd studied for. And then an old cat named Tama, his kidneys giving out, had come in one night with an elderly woman who never returned to pay for his care, and Hannah had taken him home rather than let him die alone on a cold table. And somewhere in the dark of her apartment, with the lights off, the cat had started, impossibly, to talk. She still could not explain it, not to her mother, not to her sister, not even fully to herself, and she had long since stopped trying. But she remembered, with a clarity that hadn't dulled with the years, the low, rough voice in the dark telling her not to carry so much on her own back, that the animals she worried over were stronger than she gave them credit for, that pity was not the same thing as love, and she ought to learn the difference. He had told her, in those same nights, that there were things worth knowing which could not be seen, and that she was too fond of believing knowledge alone had ever saved anyone. On the last night before he closed his eyes for good, he had thanked her simply for taking care of him and told her to go and be happy, and she had cried for a long time afterward in a dark apartment that felt, all at once, very quiet. It was around then, in that same strange stretch of days, that she had finally seen the parts of Kenji the ledger talk had always hidden. There had been a small dog with a failing heart, an owner who could not stay for the end, and Kenji crouched low in the lamplight, keeping company with a patient who had no one else, his voice never once wavering and his hands never once losing their gentleness. That night she understood, all at once, that his coldness had never been an absence of feeling, only a place to keep it where it wouldn't get in the way of steady hands. He had built himself that way on purpose. She came to realize, the same patient way he built everything, because a vet who cried through every loss couldn't keep working long enough to be any use to the next animal who needed him. The business talk, she understood eventually, had never been the whole of him. Only the armor he wore over a much softer thing, the same way Tama's gruffness, in the dark, had always come wrapped around something close to tenderness. Now, in their own small clinic, with the lamp still lit and the rain starting up softly outside, gentle enough that it barely counted as rain at all, Hannah understood that she had ended up somewhere between the two of them, and that this was no small thing. She still felt for every animal that came through the door, still let herself sit with an owner a little too long when the news was bad, still charged less than she probably should for families she could tell were counting coins in the parking lot. But she had also learned, slowly, the way Kenji had once tried to warn her she would need to, that steadiness mattered more than good intentions, and that a vet who broke down every time was no help to anyone at all. She no longer thought of those two lessons, his and the cat's, as opposites pulling her in different directions. They had folded into each other over the years, until she could no longer say for certain which parts of her had come from which of them. Only that together they had made her into someone she liked better than the earnest, exhausted new graduate she had once been. Kenji came and stood beside her at the counter now, close enough that his shoulder rested against hers, and looked at the sign in the window that said they were closed, and said, in the dry way he still had, that a Nakomata who wanted his supper had better learn to ask for it properly one of these years. Muji, from his spot on the sill, only yawned, wide and unhurried, entirely unmoved by the suggestion. Hannah laughed, quietly, the small private laugh she saved for moments like this one, and reached over to scratch behind the cat's ear and felt him lean into her hand the way he did every evening, without once saying a word. She thought, not for the first time, that maybe this cat would never need to talk at all. Maybe the talking had only ever been for those first strange nights, when a frightened young vet had needed someone to tell her, plainly, that she was allowed to keep going. She thought about the baby again, the new life only just beginning, still more news than presents, and she found herself hoping, quietly, that this child would grow up hearing both halves of what she'd learned in this small room. She hoped they would learn to love a thing without needing to save every part of it, to grieve without letting the grief become the whole of them, to notice, the way Tama had once told her to notice, the things that never showed up in any textbook. She hoped, too, that they would grow up watching their father talk nonsense to an old cat every evening for no reason at all, and understand, the way she finally had, that this was simply what love looked like on a man who had never learned to say it plainly. Outside, the light rain went on falling without any hurry, tapping against the clinic's small front window, and somewhere down the street a shop was closing for the night, and the town settled, unremarkably, into evening. Kenji reached past her and switched off the lamp, and the room dimmed to the soft gray of the window light, and Muji stretched once and resettled himself for sleep exactly where he was. Hannah let Kenji take her hand as they turned toward the door, and thought, as she so often did lately, that she had come a long way from the girl who hated the man beside her, and further still from the girl who had once believed that kindness and steadiness could not live in the same person. An old cat had taught her that they could. In a handful of strange, unrepeatable nights, she still could not fully explain, and a difficult, dry-humored man had spent 8 quiet years proving the lesson true in daylight. And that, perhaps, is where this story finally comes to rest, in a small, tight-budgeted clinic with the sign still swinging gently outside. A young cat who had never yet spoken, and perhaps never would, and a new life on its way that would grow up without ever quite knowing why, held safe inside everything the two of them had learned. And so, tonight's story comes to a gentle close. The voices fade, the rooms grow quiet, and whatever weight was carried through this one telling can finally be set down. Thank you for staying with us through the night, for letting this story keep you company in the dark, and for trusting it to carry you towards sleep. Wherever you are now, I hope your body has grown heavy and warm. Your thoughts have slowed to almost nothing, and the last worries of the day have quietly let go of you. May your rest be deep and unbroken. May your dreams be soft if you dream at all. And may the morning arrive gently with soft light and no hurry, giving you exactly the kind of waking you need. There is nothing more to listen for tonight. No task waiting, no ending to chase. Just this quiet and you drifting further into it. If you find your way back here on another night, more stories will be waiting, ready whenever you need them. For now, let go completely. You are safe. You are held. You can rest. Good night.